Dembski.
Good morning. Thanks for this opportunity to be here. I'm grateful to Christopher Hitchens and to Preston Wood for giving me this opportunity. I want to address first the existence of God, and then in my next 10 minutes address the goodness of God. The existence of God is really the weightier question. Once that's settled, the goodness of God follows, I would say, straightforwardly. Although I could rehearse standard arguments for God's existence, I want in this debate to take a different tack. Christopher Hitchens disbelieves in God's existence. Why? Lack of evidence and evils perpetrated in the name of religion, he says. Yet his book, God is Not Great, reveals a more basic reason. Hitchens, as a scientific reductionist, believes science has given us new knowledge and that it destroys religious faith. What is this new knowledge? According to Hitchens, it is Darwinian evolution. You may ask what a chapter on evolution is doing in a book defending atheism. In that chapter, Hitchens explains, quote, "We no longer have any need of a God to explain what is no longer mysterious." Let this sink in. Religion, according to Hitchens, renders biological origins mysterious. But now that Darwin has come and shown how natural selection explains biological origins, all is clear. Fellow atheist Richard Dawkins put it more memorably. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. It's no coincidence that Richard Dawkins, the world's best-known atheist, is also an evolutionary biologist. Atheists, like everyone else, need a creation story. Without God in the picture, something like Darwinian evolution has to be true. And so Hitchens, though a humanities guy, lectures his readers on proofs of evolution. Let's look at a few of these proofs as he gives them. If Darwin got it right, then our genes are cobbled together over a long evolutionary history, accumulating lots of useless DNA, junk, because it's easier for natural selection to keep copying junk than editing it out. This sounds plausible, but it is subject to experimental test. In fact, recent findings show that much of this so-called junk DNA regulates gene expression. This is true even of repetitive DNA, the quintessential DNA junk. A forthcoming book titled The Myth of Junk DNA details these findings. 2. The Cambrian explosion. This refers to a narrow slice of the fossil record in which the main animal body plans appear suddenly without any precursors. The Cambrian explosion was a mystery in Darwin's day, and it remains a mystery to this day. Paleontologist Peter Ward writes about the Cambrian explosion as follows, quote, "The seemingly sudden appearance of skeletonized life has been one of the most perplexing puzzles of the fossil record. How is it that animals as complex as trilobites and brachiopods could spring forth so suddenly, completely formed without a trace of their ancestors in the underlying strata? If ever there was evidence suggesting divine creation, surely the Precambrian and Cambrian transition, known from numerous locations across the face of the earth, is it." Now, Ward, like Hitchens, is an atheist, so he tries to soften this statement later, but the mystery remains. For more on the Cambrian explosion, see my book, The Design of Life. 3rd point, the inverted retina. Vertebrate eyes have nerve cells in front of the light-sensitive retinal cells. This means that light first has to pass through a barrier before being detected. This seems counterintuitive, but there are good functional reasons for it. A visual system needs 3 things: speed, resolution, and above all, sensitivity. If the eye isn't sensing light, it's useless. Now, it turns out that the light-sensitive cells are the most oxygen-greedy cells of all cells, and they get their oxygen from blood. The sensitivity here is truly astounding. Some frog eyes can sense the smallest unit of light, a single photon. Positioning the nerves in front of the light-sensitive retinal cells ensures maximal blood supply to the retina and thus maximal sensitivity. But the story gets better. In 2007, it was reported in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that Müller glial cells, these are the little cells, the fat cells that coat the nerves, act as optical fibers conveying light to the retina. As the abstract in the article notes, quote, "Their parallel array in the retina is reminiscent of fiber optic plates used for low distortion image transfer. Thus, Muller cells seem to mediate the image transfer through the vertebrate retina with minimal distortion and low loss. This finding elucidates a fundamental feature of the inverted retina as an optical system and ascribes a new function to the glial cells. So the vertebrate eye is much more sophisticated than Darwinists, on their low expectations of design, suspected. And thanks to these Muller glial cells, the eye's resolution is magnificent. This is completely unexpected. The problems with Hitchens' proofs of evolution don't end here. All his proofs are easily deconstructed. I'm happy to do so during the Q&A, and I have his book with me. Hitchens is obsessed with the human eye, the same eye that has allowed him to read and educate himself as an atheist. Observing different types of eyes in nature, he repeats the chestnut that natural selection gradually has turned a light-sensitive spot into a full-fledged camera eye. No mention that eyes have to be built in embryological development, or that eyes are only as good as their associated neural processing. No details about the genetic changes that would be needed to affect such a transformation. And it's not just that Hitchens doesn't provide that, nobody provides that when they tell these just-so stories about how the eye evolved. But to really make his case, Hitchens cites Dan Nilsson and Susan Pelger's mathematical model of eye evolution, which he claims shows that eyes could evolve in a geological instant. Let me tell you a secret about mathematical models and computer simulations. Unless you tether them to real observable processes, you can use them to prove anything, in which case they prove nothing. The model of Nilsson and Pelger, which Hitchens praises loudly, is of this sort. I can write a computer program that evolves Richard Nixon into Christopher Hitchens, the scary thought. Such simulate prove absolutely nothing. I know what you're all thinking. Since the evidence for evolution is so underwhelming, and since Hitchens has hitched his wagon to evolution, shouldn't he now be ready to abandon evolution and consider the existence of God? Yet this is precisely what he will not do. His atheism demands a materialistic form of evolution, and there's only one going theory of it, namely Darwinism. The alternative, which places us here as the result of design, is for him a non-starter. It's unthinkable. In regarding design as unthinkable, Hitchens puts himself in an atheist straitjacket. For the atheist, we must be here as the result of a blind, purposeless evolutionary process. There are no other options. Atheism demands evolution. Okay, it's not that evolution forces you to be an atheist, but if you are an atheist, that is your only option. For the theist, on the other hand, it's possible that God used an evolutionary process to deposit us here. But it's also possible that God deposited us here in ways that make our design evident. Either of these are live options for the theist, and the theist can consider them fairly. Atheism, however, cannot live without Darwin. Hitchens needs evolution to be true. His treatment of it is therefore calm and deferential, albeit mistaken. By contrast, his treatment of theology and biblical studies is boorish and obtuse. For instance, Hitchens dismisses Israel's time in Egypt and Sinai as myths lacking all archaeological evidence. Yet that evidence is readily available. Take, for instance, James Hoffmeier's books on the topic, published by that flaming fundamentalist publisher, Oxford University Press. Or consider Hitchens' view of Jesus.
Hotline alert.
There is, according to him, quote, little or no evidence for the life of Jesus, close quote. Come again? It's one thing to deny the miracles attributed to Jesus, but to say Hitchens is, quote, not a historical figure, close quote, is contrarian silliness. For all his talk about freedom of inquiry and Enlightenment rationality, Hitchens exhibits a very selective concern for truth. What seems to matter most to him is not whether a claim is true, but whether it makes a good stick to beat religion. Deny that Jesus was real? If it helps advance the atheist agenda, go for it, especially since it's easy to get away with this in an age of theological illiteracy. Whenever Hitchens invokes science against religion, one gets the impression that a juggernaut is rushing forward, crushing everything in its path. Science advances, religion retreats. This is wishful thinking. Fact is, as any historian of science understands, science is not a cumulative enterprise. So reversals, retractions, and revolutions play as much a role in science as insights, illuminations, and intellectual breakthroughs. Thus, new scientific advances, far from undercutting religion, can in fact overturn anti-theistic conclusions derived from prior scientific mistakes. Chemical evolution is a case in point. Chemical evolution attempts to describe how non-living chemicals arrange themselves into first life. Atheism requires that chemicals have this ability. Darwin attempted to strengthen the atheist's hand by arguing that first life was so simple it required no designer. Darwin's argument, made in a letter to Joseph Hooker, has since shown itself to be a failed argument from ignorance. Precisely because of what Darwin didn't know about the complexity of the cell, microscopy being quite limited in the 1800s, he thought the cell was so simple that it could easily self-assemble from ordinary non-living matter. I point out to you that these arguments from ignorance charges apply both ways. I mean, it's possible to argue from ignorance for design, but it's possible also to argue from ignorance for non-design. The revolution in molecular biology of the last 50 years has given the lie to this misconception about chemical evolution. We now know that every cell and all life is composed of cells is a vastly complicated assembly of interconnected technologies that argue for intelligent design. We need to be engineers to understand what's inside the cell, and the level of engineering we find there far exceeds anything humans have invented. There's a whole field of engineering called biomimetics, where you look to the engineering that we find in living things and then use that to invent technologies for our use and pleasure. Now, if you want to see this, just the complexity of the cell, I urge you to get your PDA, call up YouTube, and punch in, quote, inner life of the cell. And my feelings won't be hurt if you do that right now while I drone on here. I just mentioned that what for Hitchens is a dirty word, intelligent design. For Hitchens, intelligent design, or ID as it's now abbreviated, is just rebranded creationism. It is religion and not science. But in fact, intelligent design covers a broad range of special sciences, including forensic science, archaeology, and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI. Intelligent design, by definition, is the study of patterns in nature that are best explained as the product of intelligence. Let me give that to you again. The study of patterns in nature that are best explained as the product of intelligence. It is a basic feature of human rationality to identify the products of intelligence and distinguish them from the products of natural forces. Okay, even our language draws that distinction. Was it the result of intention, purpose, design, intelligence? Was it the result of chance, accident, randomness, noise, necessity, chance, necessity? This is a fundamental way we have of making sense of the world. So, and many special sciences capitalize on this distinction. They would not be possible without it. In 1998, I published a statistical monograph with Cambridge University Press. It was titled The Design Inference, and Dan Panetti kindly mentioned that book. In it, I laid out a probabilistic method for drawing this distinction between design and accident. Essentially, this method triangulates on design by identifying independently given patterns, known as specifications, that are complex in the sense of being hard to reproduce by chance. And we see this in many, many different contexts. You may have seen the movie Contact, for instance, which came out the summer of 1997, but it was based on a novel by Carl Sagan, in which you have these SETI researchers, these extraterrestrial intelligence researchers, are looking for signs of intelligence from outer space. And what convinces them that they've come across an intelligence from outer space? It's not that little green men come to Earth and then we can do experiments on them. It's just that we get these radio signals. What would tell us that a radio signal is the result of intelligence as opposed to the result of random radio noise? That's a scientific question, and it's one that intelligent design poses. In fact, it's at the center of intelligent design. So to dismiss it as rebranded creationism, I think really misses the point. Anyway, if you saw that movie, there's a moment at which contact is made, where the alien intelligences have made themselves evident, and it's when the radio astronomers find a long sequence of prime numbers. These prime numbers are mathematically salient. They're specified, and they're also complex. It's a long sequence of prime numbers. It's not just prime numbers are numbers divisible by themselves in ones, so it's not just 2, 3, end of story. If you're monitoring millions of radio channels, you'll find a very brief sequence of prime numbers. But a long sequence, well, that's not going to happen by chance. And we know this. Highly improbable events happen all the time, but if that event also matches a given pattern, a specification, then we know, we're dealing with design. All the mystery novels, all the cases of forensic science depend on this sort of drawing this inference. Did this person die by foul play? That would be design. Or did they die by natural causes? That would be non-design.
You're not making any sense at all.
Okay. So this method then identifies what I call specified complexity. In the design inference, I showed how this method applies outside biology. By the way, when I did this outside biology, I was in good shape. People were writing all sorts of nice things about my work. Once I applied it in biology, though, my career went down the toilet and I can no longer get a job in the mainstream academic world. And you can actually look at this. I mean, there are wonderful endorsements on the back of of my book, which have been pulled in the paperback edition. And in fact, one of the best endorsements by philosopher of biology Bill Wimsatt at University of Chicago, who was at my dissertation defense when I did that book, or did the dissertation because it was based on a philosophy dissertation. He is, in a subsequent blurb on the back of a book, he says, "This book completely deconstructs Dembski, who's trying to take science back to the Middle Ages." Okay, that's 10 years later. So actually, I think my work has gotten better over the years.
You stupid, ignorant son of a bitch, dumb bastard!
This is how it goes. I mean, ideology infects this debate.
That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
It's a religion, if you will. The same motions are at play which Christopher Hitchens inveighs against in the religious world, I find in the academic world. Maybe we can talk about that at some point. Anyway,
you are a sad, strange little man.
Back to my remarks here. In the design inference, I showed how this method applies outside biology. Subsequent work, I showed how it applies in biology. We found that Darwinian evolution came up short and that ample evidence of design is found there. For a nice summary of this work, I would refer you to Stephen Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell, or my book, The Design of Life, which I think may be out there for sale. Just as getting from Darwinian evolution to atheism is not a big stretch, so getting from design and biology to theism is not a big stretch. Are we therefore ready to agree that God exists now? That we have seen Richard Hitchens' proofs of evolution fail, the intelligent design alternative succeed, and that his critiques of theology are self-serving? By itself, my argument establishes a designer behind the universe, a Kantian architect, if you will. For the purposes of this debate, however, I think we're pretty close to closing escrow.
Utterly deceptive twirls,
positive case for God's existence can and should be fleshed out. Typically, such a case flows from critical reflection on the big questions of life. Why is there something rather than nothing? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Why should we take morality seriously? Why is the world comprehensible to
You're
our
not making
mind?
any sense at all.
Why does mathematics, presumably a human invention, have such a precise purchase on physical reality? Each of these questions can, in my view, be answered better within a theistic than an atheistic worldview. And then there are the specific historical questions. Did Jesus really live at all? Which Christopher Hitchens seems to doubt. Did he resurrect from the dead? What is the evidence for that? If somebody raised from the dead, then it seems that there might be good evidence for the existence of a theistic deity. So all of those are questions we could raise, and I would raise them and address them if time permitted. But as I said, I'm taking a particular tack. Christopher Hitchens makes his case for atheism by looking to Darwinism. He needs that, and so I've focused on deconstructing that. And let me say this also. Intelligent design is a scientific program, but it has theological implications. That said, evolution, in the sense of a purely materialistic form of evolution, the type of evolution that Darwin came up with, also has implications. And I would say they are theological implications. They're anti-theological implications, but anti-theological implications are theological implications. When Stephen Jay Gould, for instance, who in his time was the best-known evolutionist this side of the Atlantic, remarked in his book, Ever Since Darwin, we know that we were not created in the image of a benevolent God. How does he know that? That's a theological claim. So intelligent design is friendly to theism in a way that evolution is not. And as I said, if you are an atheist, you must be an evolutionist. The implication runs from atheism to evolution. It does not run from evolution to atheism. It may be that God has just set up the world to evolve that way. That would be an option for a deity. But if you are an atheist, you must go with evolution, and a blind, purposeless form of it, one where you don't see any evidence of design. So that's where I'm going to leave the discussion about God's existence. I haven't argued for the full-blown deity, but I've gotten you at least into the ballpark of a deity. And so that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.